Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of True Consequences Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. Welcome, Mattie, to the show. I found out about you because I read an article.
One of my friends that I know named Jonathan wrote the article, and I met him for lunch. I think that's the article you're talking about. Yeah.
I was really impressed by the article. I learned a lot, and anybody who listens to the show knows that I really try to talk about all kinds of victims, all kinds of people who are missing or murdered. I really don't care if they're, a different gender than me or a different sexuality than me, or they struggle with drug addiction, or they're involved in sex work. Like, none of that stuff matters on my show. Every victim is worthy of justice. Every missing person is worthy of being found. And the thing about the article that I read that really struck me was you were talking a lot about the missing and murdered trans Indigenous people who I think often get overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
We know that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls get overlooked. We know that most missing Indigenous relatives get overlooked as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then we add the gender identity to that, and it's even worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to talk to you, have a conversation about this issue, because it's really important to me to not be like the Chicano guy explaining to the Native people what's going on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, because we've had so many stories like that already.
Yeah, and it's not my story to tell.
Right.
It's your story to tell. And it's the reason why my producer is an Indigenous woman, and she's the one who writes almost all of the missing and murdered Indigenous relative stories, because it's your story.
Mm-hmm.
It's your people's story.
Yes.
And you don't need me mansplaining it to you.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and asking me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, I think we already know, at least I know, and maybe some of my listeners know, that trans people in general experience a higher rate of violence than any other demographic.
Yes. Yes. With violence. And I think across the board with anything. I'm not sure if people are familiar with a survey that was done back in 2009, I believe it was started. And it was like 6,500 trans-identified people filled out a survey, and they named it Injustice at Every Turn because that's what they saw with the report that was given. So injustice at every turn, meaning violence, domestic violence, police encounters, healthcare, school, employment. So any type of discrimination, stuff that was going on, they saw that. And it was alarming.
Mm.
And I think one of the biggest statistics that was most alarming in that survey was seeing that 40% of trans-identified people have attempted suicide from that. 40%. And that's way multiplied times whatever, more than the national average. And I think that was like 5 or 6 at that time.
Wow.
So just that is alarming. And that's attempted.
Right.
That's just attempted suicide, not like thought about or ideations, but attempted.
And that's also self-reported on the survey, right?
Yes.
So
we as like trainers who do like TG 101s or training with service providers or different people feel that the numbers are a lot higher because people who followed through with suicide cannot fill out a survey. So we don't think about that portion also.
And if you think about the people who ended their lives, I think a lot of times their families would not even go that effort to identify them as trans because they are those same people that are probably dead naming them, and it's still going on today.
Still going on today. I've had friends who have gone to their services and felt like this is not how they would want to be buried. This is not how they would want to go. Dressed in the wrong attire.
All the photos are the wrong.
The photos, or even just somebody speaking in the wrong pronoun or giving the name that they don't go by anymore. So I've seen that in some of the services that I've been to. And I think with the statistics that I just gave out with suicide, I think a lot of that was attributed by the violence that has occurred within their life, or even non-acceptance. So there's a layer of things that might have been attributing to why a person might attempt suicide. And we know that violence is a big part of that too, especially with trans communities, because people are not familiar with trans communities.
Yeah.
My personal experience, because I identify as a Native trans woman, a strong Native transgender woman, that people are unfamiliar with us and don't know how to ask questions, or they go by what they heard or what they were taught. I tell people in trainings that hate is learned. It's a learned experience. And when you hear somebody saying faggot, queer, or homo, like in a negative way for a long time, and it comes from your family, you learn that from it. You pick up that behavior, and then you apply it to whoever you see. That's that description, and it happens over and over again. And we see that. I've seen it since, but through my teenage years, even now, as living as who I am. And a lot of times people don't know that I'm a trans woman until I come out, and I could put myself at risk because I am of the demographic. And if somebody doesn't like trans persons, they could do harm to me. So I'm still susceptible to that. Sometimes I have to think about that too. But I'm very out. I'm a very out trans woman. I'm speaking up on things. And I think that's why I got involved in the MMIWR task force. So I did a presentation, and they needed to get 2 topics done before the end of their fiscal period with the first cohort of task members. And I remember they had asked if we could do a presentation on Native LGBTQ populations and also youth, because I've moderated panels before and I've done these things before. Why don't we combine it? Let me moderate it. Let's do this, and we'll do youth. We could go back and forth. So we had a panel. So from there, after the presentation that was done, they felt a need that this needed to be part of the task force. This was a couple of years ago. I think it was at the end of 21, the first cohort of people who did the MMIWR. And the governor is the one that appointed the task force. So this is coming from the state of New Mexico and the governor's office. So I know that my boss was a part of that because I work at a community health clinic, and she was a part of that. And the Indian Affairs Department did a phenomenal job in keeping us organized on topics, having meetings, and being that support for us. And Stephanie Salazar was a big influence on that and stuff. And then Secretary Trujillo at that time was a big supporter of the task force. So they did a great job in that. So from the presentation that was done, I'm not sure if you saw the response, the NMIWR response plan that we we did.
Yes.
That was the work that this cohort did.
Wow.
So we're the ones who introduced the 2 laws that passed legislation.
That's awesome.
So that's why we have the MMIWR Day in October, and that was a success. So I went and saw so many booths, so many organizations that were being represented, and I found myself walking around talking to different organizations and entities and asking questions about how do you work with trans populations. And I found myself educating at that time still. Like, okay, so this needs to be a big part of this. So how do you include trans populations? How do you work with trans populations? Even offering training to do like a TG 101, how to work with trans populations in that sector. And I was really impressed by one program, the MOI group with the state of New Mexico, which is the Medical Investigator Office, I think it was. Like with how do you identify trans people when they're deceased or we find their murdered body? So they're asking those questions. So they gave really good answers, like inclusion was a part of that. Identity was a part of that. And it was awesome. I was relieved because a lot of times I'm the one that's educating. And then to hear feedback like, okay, we have that, or we have this in place, or this is what we do. And it was a sigh of relief. Yeah. But I wish we had so much more of those sighs of relief.
Sure. Absolutely. I think that there's so much opportunity to provide more support to the trans community. And I don't think that the gay community does a great job of that in general. I think that there is a lot of transphobia. There's definitely a lot of racism. There's definitely a lot of other issues going on in the gay community. It's really frustrating for me because I'm a very empathetic person. And so when I see somebody suffering, like I want to do what I can to help them not suffer. And to see so many of our brothers and sisters and people, let's just say people in general, in our community that are suffering. And to know the kind of pain that gay people go through or had gone through in the 80s and 90s and 70s, and to not be able to turn that around and say, oh my gosh, you know, this person who's a part of my community is suffering. I don't understand the disconnect. It really kind of drives me crazy because we all know what it's like, and maybe not to the degree that trans people experience it, but we know what it's like to be singled out and to be discriminated against and to be treated poorly and to be denied your basic human rights.
That's happening in the country today, or even trans affirming care and people being misguided by what they know. Like people people are making decisions for a state when they don't know about the population and how detrimental from their decision it could make for a young child who's coming out and wanting to have trans affirming care and stuff. So I feel like people's philosophy when they do these wretched things are thinking, oh, they want to do surgery when they're like 12 or 10. And that's not the case. Trans affirming care for somebody who's young is making that decision of like going on puberty blockers.
Yeah.
Maybe they want to wait. So there's mechanisms that we looked at that could help somebody. Like for me, if I was that young and it was supported in my family, I would have jumped on it.
Sure.
I would have loved to have done that, but I really didn't like see the transition till I was an adult and more androgynous in those years than going on 24/7 as identified as trans and making that transition, but more of living androgynously for a long time, but seeing the whole dynamics. Like I came out as gay first.
Yeah.
And because that was the word.
Sure.
And I didn't hear trans until the late 1990s. So I'm like, oh, okay, so I identify with that. So I am transgender. And it was just the one word.
Sure.
And the word before that was transsexual.
Right.
When I was 14, I remember going into our public library, looking at the Dewey Decimal System with that card thing that some people don't even know about.
Yeah,
so,
the card catalog.
Yeah, so looking up the definition, going to the book, looking up the word in a certain page and reading it, and then knowing the definition of a transsexual is somebody who was getting surgery done to affirm their gender. So I'm like, okay, it's not going to be that evasive. So I don't want surgery. So I guess I don't identify as transsexual. So at that time, the words were like transsexual, pre-op, post-op type of thing. Yep. Things have changed. So I'm like, okay, that's not me. I think when I first came out, I came out as gay. And then when I heard transgender, I went with transgender. And from there, I've seen the progression of how we identify like non-binary, gender non-conforming, different gender identities under the umbrella or the spectrum.
Yeah.
So in seeing that in the progression, I think a lot of advocacy is being done. And even with the advocacy that's being done, we're still seeing the hate in the community.
Yeah.
Like pure wretchedness from people who are not familiar with our community and stuff. So my thing is a lot of times I want to educate somebody who's not familiar. I tell people there's no such, ask me a personal question if you need to. And I said, ask me, but don't ask somebody else who identifies as trans, but I'm giving you that permission so that you will learn and get your questions answered. And it's interesting that a lot of times in trainings or even just in society that people are so enthralled or concentrating on what's between our legs rather than what's between our ears. So I kind of make it a point in some of the trainings that I do to repeat that, like, think about what's between my ears, not what's between my legs.
Well, and it's just such a bizarre thing to focus on because, I mean, honestly, I don't know any other group of people that gets that, that gets those questions about their sexual parts. Like,
like, how do you have sex?
It's never okay to ask that to anybody. Why would you think it's okay? Why would you think it's okay?
It's not okay.
Right. And if you're curious about stuff, the internet is there. You can learn some things on the internet. You know, you don't have to make it completely awkward for somebody and uncomfortable. It's just not appropriate.
You can Google transgender. You could Google, you can Google things now.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And learn a lot through that. Or even find an agency, an organization. Like here in Albuquerque, there's a Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. And that started out of the trunk of a car, two trans men. Out of the trunk of a car, now it's a big organization. And throughout the years, when they were developing, I've seen the progression and providing services to our community and reaching out to different places and just being visible in the community. I'm happy that the organization was there. And I have been a board member of that organization. And I'm in emeritus status now. So seeing the progression. So as the years have gone by, I've been doing trans advocacy for over 20 years now.
Wow.
So I kind of see myself like doing different things or turning a different direction. So just that, like some of the different work that I'm going to be doing in the future is some things that I'm happy and excited to do because we do have younger populations who are working, who are advocating, who are doing the training, who are taking over to do the work that's being done. So that makes me happy. And coming from a Native community too, like we do have some people who are involved in doing advocacy and trainings, but I feel like there needs to be a little bit more of us out there who need to step up to the plate and do stuff. I'm more than willing to mentor and educate. I'm like, here, I'll give this to you and you can take it and work with it.
I think there's a misconception out there in the world of people who are interested in justice. And I think the misconception is that because there are two-spirit people in tribes, there's this misconception that all Native people are accepting of the LGBTQIA community. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Colonization has really impacted our Native communities throughout the years, throughout the decades, throughout the centuries. And even our own people have been affected by colonization in that sense with gender identity and looking at how we identify too. I keep on bringing up the training, but these are some of the topics that we talk about. I tell people that in anthropology, if anthropology is one-sided in the history that's being talked about it. And if we had Native people who were anthropologists back then when they were documenting things, our whole story, our whole history would be different. I guarantee you that. And with what people saw when they first came here, because of their upbringing and their religious background, when they saw two men together, if they saw couples together were of the same sex, they thought that was wrong. So from there, I feel that's what was being taught. And we see it in different articles and literature and stuff, people talking about it, people bringing it up. So even our own people who have been influenced by different things or have been influenced by colonization have taken that upon themselves and think that way too. There are some tribal members throughout the country who are trying to grasp onto the traditional values and ways and incorporate that. I remember I worked at a nursing home for 10 years, and that's where I started relearning my language and my culture and my traditions at a faster rate.
I just want to point out that when you say the traditional ways, you're not talking about like the colonizing traditional ways of Catholic Mass and all of that.
Yeah,
you're talking
like
about
traditional values of
the Native, of your community.
I'm Navajo, I'm Diné. So my traditional teachings, like going to ceremony or singings and prayers. The elderly that I took care of were Diné women, elderly, who used to say, I remember this elder woman who used to run her fingers through my hair. And one time I asked her that, why do you do that? And she goes, because it brings good luck. Because of people like you. And I'm like, oh, okay. And sometimes I would ask like stories. Did you have friends like me when you were younger? Like, yeah. They used to like go up in the hills screaming and everything. And they were good friends of mine. So there was like history and talking about it. And some elders I've heard throughout me in my childhood and my teenage years is like, you're not supposed to laugh about them. You don't laugh at them about them. You don't bother them and stuff. So you don't mistreat them because they're valuable in your family or in your community. So for me, I grew up in a household where I feel that wasn't very accepting because my father didn't accept it. But as I grew up and grew older, I got involved in substance use and abuse. I stopped drinking at 24, and that's when I really started looking at what direction I wanted to go and stuff. So that's when my advocacy started. And learning all of the stuff that I know now, especially with like the Native LGBTQ two-spirit community, because not everybody identifies as two-spirit.
Right.
Like I don't identify as two-spirit.
Right.
So looking at that also too. So that's like a whole nother subject that could be talked about it. But I think within history, like when people bring up Stonewall, that's the catalyst for gay rights. And so as a Native trans person, I'm like, okay, so we were here before Stonewall. We were here before colonization. So how do I look at that? And how does that empower me when I'm looking at that in that sense? Because when I first came out gay and stuff, for me, it was all about the rainbow stickers and gay pride and the flags and Stonewall, yay. But when I started learning my history, and I think that's one of the things too, is that learning our history as Native people, just in general as Native people, it's a lot different. And as Native LGBTQ two-spirit populations, when we learn our history and when we look back at history, how was that influenced upon us? Like, how's that empowering? For me, it's empowering because I know there were influential people in the 1800s, 1700s who identify like me. They may not have said I'm a trans person, but I know that they were living the life that they were living that could be similar to what I have now or who I am. Like Wewa has a book and Hustain Kla is a part of that. But there's history. There's actual history and documented about people like me, people like us who are Native LGBTQ two-spirit population, and what they brought to the community. Even within my own people of Diné people, I believe they were doing like interviews with some of our community members in the late 1800s, and they would talk about how we were recognized or how we were revered, how we were talked about in a positive way.
Mm.
And then that same documentation of interviews changed. The shift had changed in maybe like the 1920s, 1930s, and started turning negative.
Mm.
So from then on, it started that process.
Well, that's when a lot of the propaganda against gay people
Yeah.
started coming out too at the same time, right? So this was like this kind of strange obsession that a couple of really rich white guys had about sexuality, about sex in general.
Mhm.
They brought all these really weird puritanical views to the world, and that's
Yeah.
when I think that's when we really started to see a lot. I mean, there was always problems, but that's when it started ramping up. And then you go into the 20th century, and it just continues, right?
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to the conversation of missing and murdered Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. I got involved because I had a friend in 2009 who was murdered here in Albuquerque. I believe she was stabbed, and her murder was unsolved. So I think part of the initiative that they're doing in the task force is to open up cold cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things too. But my thing with our population, like what you described, like with the acceptance with families and things that are changing dynamics, is that with families who were not accepting of their trans child or gave them the wrong name or the wrong pronouns, like how do you go to the family and say, can you open up a cold case, or you should look up into cold case and doing this? And it just brings back that hurt.
Yeah.
So how do we do that in a better way? How do we do that in a good way? And how do we approach that in that sense? And I think even not just trans, but I think our gay relatives have been murdered also.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at that and how do we work in that? Because sexual orientation, gender identity is a big factor in how one identifies and how the family looks at them also. So how do we get involved in that? And going back to trans populations, I know that there was a murder in South Dakota also that happened. A trans woman was murdered, was shot. And I think they apprehended the person that killed her. But she was a part of her community. Her community and her friends and family, they loved her and they spoke about her in a good way also. We should be recognized in that way, like being accepting of who we are. But unfortunately, we don't have that nowadays. And that could be a factor in some of the violence that happens to us.
Absolutely.
And I think it's more of being murdered or being violence happening towards us rather than missing. Because I feel like because we have friends that we confide in, like we know who's going where, and we know who's with who, or we check in. Like even with me, like if I'm unfamiliar with people, I tell my friends, hey, I'm going with this person, or hey, I'm over here, or hey, just checking in just to tell you this feels a little shady. So I find myself like checking in with different people, and I have trusted friends that I tell where I'm going, or I tell people what I'm doing. So I think within our community, we have a close-knit community where we know about each other, what somebody's doing. So I think bigger issues than being murdered or violence being upon us where we're murdered. Like I said, I'm still susceptible. Because I was a trans woman.
I love that there's a sense of community and of having each other's back, but I hate that it has to happen. And I think that's the thing that when we look at people who are dealing with this, who are coming to terms with their gender identity, trying to navigate how to exist in their households with their families who may or may not accept them, and then to go out into the world and to be completely at risk for violence on a daily basis. It breaks my heart that you have to do that you have to continually do that. I'm glad that you have that support system. And I'm so glad that there are people out there looking out for each other, but I just wish that the greater community could do that for everybody.
Yeah. I the same way. But unfortunately, society's not that way. Because history is totally taught in a different sense. And with the task force that has happened, I'm glad I'm part of the task force. I'm glad that I was a part of it. And looking, I think, in the future of my WR days, and I really like the language of MMIWP or MMIWR because it includes relatives and people. And in that sense, and identifying. And I think the biggest thing also with identity is that a lot of times we're taught just binary, male and female. And if you're not male or female and you're something else, we're forgetting about intersex populations because people
Absolutely.
can be born intersex.
Yeah.
So you're not just born male or female. You can also be born intersex. So
Right.
what about the category of intersex? And
Yeah.
then with gender identity, there's so many spectrums that we can identify under.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I love that there's so much diversity and color in the world. I think it makes the world a beautiful place if we can all just learn to accept each other and help each other out, you know? And that's the thing about the MMIP movement. And, you know, I think it's gotten to a point where it's kind of trendy now to, oh, you know, I support MMIP, I do this, I do that. But I don't think a lot of people really understand what is happening and how difficult it is for somebody who, let's say, like your friend got murdered. How almost impossible it is to get anybody to pay attention already just because they're Native. That's the first hurdle. But now you throw in gender identity on top of that, and it makes it even worse. And then you add maybe some substance abuse issues or people who turn to sex work to provide for themselves because they have no other way to do anything.
And then you have people saying that, oh, it's because they did sex work. Oh, because they were doing their drugs and because they were drinking, it's their own fault. And that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And I think society does that much more with Native LGBTQ, Two-Spirit and trans populations. And that's said a lot more than just in general with Native populations. Because I know with Native populations, a lot of times those factors are put into play too. Oh, she was probably doing sex work, or oh, he was probably drinking, or oh, it's their own fault. Because sometimes people say that, even with our own community. Well, you should have told that person that or they should have told that person their identity, or they should have told that person this and that. And I'm like, okay, well, people don't know the background to how a person feels or their behaviors,
or why they're doing that.
Even I had to learn that.
Yeah.
Even I myself, because when I stopped drinking, I had a different mind frame with prevention, doing things. Because my main job is doing HIV prevention work and STIs and stuff too. But I think even just looking at like my own sobriety and looking at stuff that I was kind of like the older sister or the mother, or now the older grandmother that would get after her kids and, okay, what are you doing now? What's going on and stuff. But now I'm looking at it in a different sense after going back to school and taking classes and really looking at the dynamics. And I'm feeling that I'm less stressed now because I cannot change somebody at all. I can't change their behavior. And getting after somebody is not going to really make a difference. It's up to them. The only thing I could ever say now is that it's up to you. It's up to what you want to do and how you're going to pursue that. And I'll totally support that if that's the change you want to do, and leave that. Compared to Mother Mattie a while back, or Sister Mattie saying this and that and giving feedback. And I look at stuff in a different sense now after things have happened. And I think with violence, seeing that with our community, and I've lost a lot of friends, a lot of Navajo friends throughout the years to violence, to substance use disorders, to different things, suicide and also illness too. A lot of our community members are not here. And just thinking about that and how they've gone.
What are some of the challenges the trans community faces when somebody goes missing who is Indigenous?
I think there's several things. I think first and foremost is family, if they're accepting, if they're willing to give information or they're giving the right information. Because sometimes they could be given a different name. Oh, this is the name they were born with, but not saying, oh, this is what they went by now. And this is how they identified, giving that information. And I think also when media gets a hold of it too, that they may misgender, they may not use the right pronouns, or they may use the different name. I myself don't use dead name because for me it's a cultural thing. Yeah. It's because like with being Diné and looking at death, like when somebody passes on with culture sense or traditional ways, from what I was taught or what I was told or what I heard when I was growing up, is that when somebody passes on, like you let them go and don't bring them up because you're calling them back. You're calling their spirits back. Look at it in that way and let them go. And I do think about like my brother, my sister, and people have passed on before me, but I just think about it. I did advocacy for a while, and I remember when I was living in LA, that was a big thing too with media. How do we do training with media? Yeah. How do we look into that? And I think we did one training here in New Mexico when I moved back. I think Adrian was a part of that and did it, but I think when that happens, media gets a hold of that and kind of mislabels a lot of stuff in articles. And then I think also furthermore is the community. How does the community address that?
I think that's a huge problem that a lot of people who are cisgender may not even think about, because if, for example, the family isn't supportive and they don't use the proper name, the proper pronouns, and maybe don't even give a picture of what the person looks like today, people might be looking for somebody completely different and may stumble upon this person and not even realize that that's who they're looking for. It's a huge problem, because if you think about it, whenever somebody goes missing, immediately, I've had it happen where there's not a lot of information about them and people get mad because they're like, where were they? When was the last time they were seen? What were they wearing? Like, they want to know all of those things. And if you're giving inaccurate information, it's not going to help you find that person.
Or if the friends knew the person a lot more than the family, the friends have more information to give, but they're not asked because the family doesn't involve the friends or the chosen family of that person to do those identifiers or be a part of like an investigation. That's the hard part too. It's like with family members, I could just be a friend, but my friend who was murdered, like they go to the family and they go from that context, then the chosen family. So it maybe even that could be another dynamic to look at in the next couple of years, because our governor is going on for another 4 years. So I think in May or June, she signed over another, like, to continue the task force. So the task force is continuing. We're still meeting, and it's kind of changed. The dynamics have changed in that. So, but we're still meeting, and we're looking at how, like, what other stuff can we add on to this? And that could be one of the subjects that could be added on. Like, how do we include chosen family, especially with trans populations? How do we get the information that we need from chosen family or friends of the person who identified in that sense?
I think a lot of people who aren't in the LGBTQ two-spirit community don't understand the importance of chosen family, but also sometimes those people know that person more than anybody in their actual family. There are times where people who are in this community are ostracized, they're kicked out, they're never spoken to by the entire family. Maybe a grandparent says, that's it, we're not talking to that person anymore, and the whole family has to fall in line. So when you're getting information from some of these people, sometimes they may be even abusive to that person.
Yeah, family members can be like that. I've had family members or people say that, well, that's what I know. That's what I knew them about and give them the wrong pronouns. And I'm like, no, that's not. Even my own relative, when she passed on, I had a trans relative who passed on, and a sister was very adamant, like, well, that's how I knew them. Yeah. I don't want to say the wrong pronoun, but that's how I knew them and stuff. I'm like, no, this is what she went by. This was her name. Yeah. She changed her name. And some of us do legally change our name. Yep. Even when we illegally change our name, the family still goes by it. And usually that's the case when they say, oh, this is what you grew up as, or this is what I knew you by or know you by. I'm like, well, I changed that so you can call me something different.
Well, I mean, people do it all the time. When a woman marries a husband and gets his last name, nobody has a hard time calling her by that last name. Why is it so difficult to call somebody by the name that they want to be called? Just call them that. It doesn't hurt you.
Yep. Yeah. But going back to our topic of MMIWR, when I said that I attended the event and saw a lot of people, first of all, I think we need a bigger venue. And then the next one, I was like, I should set up a booth and just have a sign that says LGBTQ and just have resources, because I found myself going to each booth and asking about LGBTQ, especially trans populations, and how they work with them, and getting like information from them, or them starting to ask questions. So I'm like, I can make a separate table that people can ask questions, especially pertaining to this topic, and looking at domestic violence or violence in general, statistics, and looking at murder, missing, and relatives, or asking those questions, I think would be great. Yeah.
What do you think the average person, the average listener could do to be more mindful, more supportive, more helpful to not just the trans community, the Indigenous community, and with all of the people who are going missing, all the people who have been murdered? What can they do?
I think they can do a couple of things, but I think first and foremost, learn more about the population, learn more about the people who they may be unfamiliar with. I don't know everything, so if I want to learn something, I Google it or I look it up on the computer or I do my research on it. So maybe our population can do that if they're unfamiliar with Native issues, like if they're non-Native and want to learn more. There's a lot. You can learn the history of our people. They could learn about different things because I feel that colonization, generational historical trauma is a part of a lot of the factors that happens within our community. Like even with substance use. And I know that outside entities, and some people may disagree with me, but outside entities of Native populations, like sometimes we're viewed as just drinkers and drunks and stuff. Even in our gay clubs, oh, you're just another drunk Indian. You're just a drunk, are you one of the drunk natives? When I was sober and I know where else to go, I would go to like a gay bar here in Albuquerque and hear that. And I was like, wait a minute, I've been sober for 4 years. I just come to dance and have fun. And to this day, we're still called that. So looking at that and looking at also the issues, I think is another thing. Like, how do we look at some of these issues? And I think the biggest thing is how do we look at our own biases as a person? Where does that come from? If we're saying shit about people, where's that coming from? Because I say shit about people. I talk about people. Yeah. So how do I look at myself and my biases and where's that coming from? Yeah.
Yeah, I think where's that coming from is a great question to ask in a lot of these situations. Where is the substance abuse coming from? Right?
Yeah.
Where is all of this pain and trauma coming from? Because a lot of people who have never dealt with substance abuse or have never had somebody in their life who deals with substance abuse don't understand that there is a lot of pain and a lot of trauma behind that behavior. The reason people are going down that road is because they cannot cope with what's going on inside of them. That's not just like somebody who's just having a good time drinking. They're actually struggling and in a lot of pain. Where is it coming from is a really good question to ask. I think that there's also a misconception that it's just a bunch of white people going onto the reservation and kidnapping people and murdering them. I think that there is probably a level of that. There probably is some of that happening, but there's also a lot of internalized abuse, I think.
There could be different factors, but we don't know until like somebody goes missing or murdered.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people ask us questions like, how did they pass on or what happened to them or why did this happen? And sometimes the answers we don't know.
Right.
Because we don't know them.
Right.
We don't know what's going on internally with them. We don't know what their behavior was. We don't know exactly what was going on in their life.
Or what circles they were moving in. Yeah.
Because sometimes we could be good at painting a good picture about somebody, especially for somebody who we love or is a family member.
Sure.
Like, we're not going to talk smack about them. We're going to talk about them in a good way. But there may have been factors to what may have happened, but that shouldn't be the issue.
Right.
The issue is that they were either murdered or they're missing. So how do we find them?
Yeah.
What do they call that? That could be like a double-edged sword because people can look at it in that sense or that way.
Yeah.
Because people do think like that.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I want to bring up in this conversation was like some of the challenges that are still faced in resources.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
The Four Corners Search and Rescue, they have like people who search for missing persons and they have dogs. And so they need resources of like gas money or food or searching with family and stuff, or how do we fund that? Or how do we fund families to search for their loved ones, or what resources can we give them to be proactive in the advocacy that they're doing if their family member was murdered? Like, how do we get justice for their family member?
Yeah.
How do we seek that justice, and especially when people don't know who murdered them?
Right.
Like, how do we find out? And I'm really glad that like with the cold cases that are being opened up, then also I think the time frame of looking for missing persons now is different. Like, you don't wait 48 hours now. It's like right away.
Yeah.
You look right away. And then I also asking the public or just people who are listening to, like, if you see a post that has somebody missing, share it.
Please.
People actually reach out to me because they know that I've been on the task force or do the work. Like, hey, Mattie, can you share this? And so this is what happened. Can you share this? And I shared, I recently got one of those posts like this I think it was a relative that went missing and stuff. So I shared it in my Facebook, and because I have a lot of people on Facebook and stuff too. So I think even like task force members, I had a friend who went missing, and the sister reached out, and I said, I'll tell the task force. And we reached out and put posts up and stuff. He's no longer with us, but just putting out that post really like made the family feel much better, and knowing that they're searching for them and stuff.
I think that's a huge thing. And it's something that kind of frustrates me because I'm constantly sharing missing posters, constantly sharing missing flyers, constantly sharing this stuff. And a lot of times it seems like Facebook says that from going to everybody. And so I'll get maybe 3 shares, even though I've got a couple thousand followers. It's just really difficult. So please, if you follow those MMIW, MMIR, MMIP groups, see those flyers, share them. It goes a long way. It seems like such a little thing, but it really does help, because you never know. Maybe somebody on your friends list knows somebody who knows something. Mm-hmm. You never know.
Yeah.
And if it was your family member, if it was your relative, you would want the same thing. You would want them looking for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also feel that this is a subject that's going to continue, and that's the hard part.
Yeah.
To know that we're still going to have missing and murdered relatives. So how do we address some of these issues? And I think one of the things that we talked about in the task force is prevention. The prevention of what's going on, or the prevention of teaching our youth about missing and murdered, MMIWR, teaching about substance use, teaching about the social determinants of health spectrum, and being honest with our relatives and also within our communities. What resources will we have available, or what can we do to change the dynamics within our own tribal communities?
Yeah.
So the task force is comprised of different tribal entities. There's tribal leadership that have been a part of the task force. We've had senators and House of Representatives be a part of the meetings, jump in on the meetings. We've even had, like at the events, our governor would go and represent and talk about the task force.
I just want to thank you for coming on the show and bringing this perspective. I'd love to have you on again and talk some more, because I feel like there's a lot more we can talk about.
There's a lot. There's like, this is just one subject, but like I said, there's like many topics, especially with trans populations, that we could talk about. And just one last thing, going back to the survey that I mentioned in 2009.
Yeah.
They did one in 2015 called the U.S. Trans Survey. And they had 27,000 respondents to that one.
Wow.
And still it was the same things. And you can Google this.
Okay.
If you Google U.S. Trans Survey, all that data and information's on there. And this year, I and a couple of Native colleagues were part of the 2022 U.S. Trans Survey that's going to come out. They just got done with the survey. We just had a meeting about it. And they said the report's probably not going to come out until like the end of this year. So like the numbers have multiplied dramatically. So I think there was, like, they said over 100,000 respondents.
Wow.
Yes. And so they're going to do another report at the end of the year and have that out.
That's a good sample size.
Yes. It's huge. Going from 6,900 to 27, now over, like, it's phenomenal. I don't know the exact number, but
that's
it's
amazing.
A lot of respondents. And also in this survey, they do subcategories. They have like Alaska Native American respondents that are subcategorized. And then there's also the different populations that are subcategorized. So you can look at that data also. And people want to look at the violence or the discrimination that's happening with trans community. That is a document to really look at, because it has percentages. It has alarming rates of, like, when trans people went to school from kindergarten to 12th grade, having to deal with all that discrimination from teachers, from individuals, from people in general, and dealing with violence and having to deal with that, being told not to wear makeup, or even physical violence being put upon them. And knowing that out of the respondents, like I think it was like 90% of respondents, like from kindergarten through 12th, had experienced some type of discrimination. It's very, very alarming. And looking at that, and I know that the dynamics of change are kind of changing, but we're still fighting. And to honestly say that even some of my own tribal members feel that way. Some of my own tribal members think that way also too. And those are the conversations that I'm like, We need to change this dynamic.
Yeah.
We have a ban on gay marriage in our Navajo Nation, which is ridiculous.
See, I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah. And then also, I think one of the things that I think listeners could also do is learn about what's going on in different tribal communities, because not all tribal communities are the same. Some tribal communities have gay marriage. They have equal rights for LGBTQ two-spirit people in their tribal communities. And then, unfortunately, there are some tribes who ban things, who restrict things, who say you can't do this in their tribal communities. So I think being aware of tribal communities and what their histories or what their stance on Native LGBTQ two-spirit populations is could be something that they could learn and also would be supportive of, because some of the listeners could be Native and the Native identified. And if you're a tribal member of your community, how are Native LGBTQ two-spirit people being included in the community? And then also, how do people get involved? That's another thing too, the intentional inclusion.
Thank you, Mattie. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that this is just the beginning of these conversations. You're always welcome back on the show.
Yes. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And stay safe, New Mexico.